Hi everyone, this is part 14 of my devotion series We Are Called, focusing on the Old Testament prophets. And today we're going to focus on the prophet Ezekiel. So our reading is Ezekiel chapter 1 verses 1 through chapter 2 verse 10. It says, "In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river Chebar, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was on him there. As I looked, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually. And in the middle of the fire, something like gleaming amber. In the middle of it was something like 4 living creatures. This was their appearance. They were of human form. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings on their 4 sides they had human hands, and the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each of them moved straight ahead without turning as they moved. As for the appearance of their faces, the 4 had the face of a human being, the face of a lion on the right side, the face of an ox on the left side, and the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. Each moved straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. In the middle of the living creatures, there was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. The fire was bright, and lightning issued from the fire. The living creatures darted to and fro like a flash of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the 4 had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved. Their rims were tall and awesome, for the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them. When the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When they moved, the others moved. When they stopped, the others stopped. And when they rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Over the heads of the living creatures, there was something like a dome, shining like crystal, spread out above their heads. Under the dome, their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each of the creatures had 2 wings covering its body. When they moved, I heard the sound of their wings, like the sound of mighty waters, like the thunder of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army. When they stopped, they let down their wings. And there came a voice from above the dome over their heads. When they stopped, they let down their wings. And above the dome over their heads, there was something like a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of a throne was something that seemed like a human form. Upward from what appeared like the loins, I saw something like gleaming amber, something that looked like fire enclosed all around. And downward from what looked like the loins, I saw something that looked like fire, and there was a splendor all around. Like the bow in a cloud on a rainy day, such was the appearance of the splendor all around. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. He said to me, "O mortal, stand up on your feet, and I will speak with you." And when he spoke to me, a spirit entered into me and set me up on my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. He said to me, "Mortal, I am sending you to the people of Israel, to a nation of rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have transgressed against me to this very day. The descendants are impudent and stubborn. I am sending you to them, and you shall say to them, 'Thus says the Lord God.' Whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house, they shall know that there has been a prophet among them. And you, O mortal, do not be afraid of them, and do not be afraid of their words, though briars and thorns surround you, and you live among scorpions. Do not be afraid of their words, and do not be dismayed at their looks, for they are a rebellious house. You shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house. But you, mortal, hear what I say to you. Do not be rebellious like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you." I looked, and a hand was stretched out to me, and a written scroll was on it. He spread it before me. It had writing on the front and on the back, and written on it were words of lamentation and mourning and woe. Here ends the reading. The third of the major prophets, Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a priest in the Jerusalem temple before the first time Jerusalem submitted to become a vassal state of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. In 597 BCE, many of Israel's political and religious leaders, including the young king Jehoiachin, were taken as captive exiles into Babylon, and Ezekiel was one of them, deported to a sort of concentration camp of other exiles in a swamp. And that's where Ezekiel's story begins. In the 5th year of this exile, 593 BCE, he receives a vision of God unlike anything he has ever seen before in his career as a priest, who operated that sacrificial system of the temple, but never was called to be or do anything else spectacular. The series of visions Ezekiel received includes this vision of angels he calls living creatures, which appear vastly different than the seraphs Isaiah saw. These are even stranger, human form, but with 4 faces and 4 wings each, riding on wheels within wheels, so that they never turn but can go in any direction. Those 4 faces, the human being, the lion, the ox, and the eagle, are used multiple times in the tradition of the church after this. In Revelation, John sees these living creatures surrounding the throne of God and the Lamb, proclaiming God's holiness. And from there, those 4 faces are used as the images of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Above and beyond these living creatures that represent all that God created and all that look to God and work for God, Ezekiel receives an image of God that simply baffles the mind and drives Ezekiel to awe and wonder and despair. And God will remind Ezekiel and us that God is so far beyond our own expectations by continually calling Ezekiel mortal. God is immortal, always living, while you and I and Ezekiel get one lifetime, which is really an all too brief a time. But we use this time we've been given to share God's grace. And God will use Ezekiel, many times against Ezekiel's will or wishes, to get God's message to those captive in Babylon. God's Spirit picks him up and moves him from place to place. At one point in the super popular story, God returns him to the valley just outside of Jerusalem called Gehenna, which is the word we usually translate as hell, but this valley was the garbage dump for the city. Ezekiel sees this valley as full of the bones of the people who died in the Babylonian invasion. And God, through Ezekiel, recreates the dead by restitching them back together, a model for the promise of resurrection and a vision for God's promise to return the whole people of Israel to their homeland. That story is in chapter 37. You can look that one up. Other times, God commands Ezekiel to perform symbolic actions. Like if you go back to chapter 4, where Ezekiel is commanded to make a little model of Jerusalem and then lie down on his left side for 390 days without getting up, symbolic of the 390 years of the people's rebellion and punishment. And after that is done, Ezekiel is told to lie down on his right side for 40 days, symbolic of the 40 years that God expects the Babylonian exile to last. God assigns Ezekiel a set amount of bread and water to eat and drink during that time, and in fact says that his bread should be cooked over a pile of human dung, because apparently that's what God thinks about the things we do to each other. When Ezekiel complains about that last part, God relents and says that Ezekiel can cook his bread over cow dung instead, which I'm not sure is actually any better. In chapter 33, Ezekiel is finally told that Babylon completed the destruction of Jerusalem, and God intentionally kept him from prophesying anything for a time. But then Ezekiel's oracles become about the restoration God will perform for the people. Particularly, these oracles are the earliest beginnings of what is called apocalyptic literature, or the revealing of the hidden divine reality and how that affects our world. Apocalyptic literature becomes a popular genre in the 400 years that take place between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. But because of his upbringing and career as a priest in Jerusalem, Ezekiel's focus was almost entirely on Judah's unfaithfulness and idolatry. This exile in Babylon is God's punishment for the people allowing worship practices of other gods in their land and temple, and these practices were so embedded in the culture that the only solution was to literally burn it all down and start over. But even in exile, God is not leaving the people abandoned. Ezekiel has a vision of God's presence leaving the Jerusalem temple and settling over the exiles in Babylon. Just because you can't see God, you don't have the familiar buildings and places and people doing the same things and the same words over and over, does not mean that God has abandoned us. God is with us all the time, no matter where we are or what we're doing. Ezekiel's prophecies remind us that we are all responsible for knowing God, for seeing God, and performing God's desires in our world every day. It's not just the priests in the temple or the pastors in the church that get to do what God wants. It's each of us every day and in every place. We are called to live holy lives. This is what Martin Luther would eventually call the priesthood of all believers. That all the faithful are responsible for bringing God's message of grace and hope into the world and bringing the world's pain and suffering, prayer and praise to God. We are called, my friends, to live our lives as reflections of God's grace in this world. We are holy people, adopted into God's family through our baptism to live in God's way. Ezekiel was called to his people to help them and to help us to live out our lives by reading his story. And thanks be to God for that.